The dust had barely settled on the main road into Harlan Creek, Texas, when Theodore Hale pulled his chestnut gelding to a stop outside the only dry goods store in town and asked the first person he saw where he could find a woman named Inez Kendrick. It was the summer of 1878, a year when the Texas Panhandle felt like the inside of a furnace, and the cattle towns were either booming or dying depending on which direction the railroad decided to lay its next mile of track. Harlan Creek was somewhere in the middle of those two fates, a town of perhaps 400 souls clinging to the edge of the prairie, with the grim determination of people who had nowhere better to go. There was a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a livery stable, a small hotel, and rows of sun-bleached wooden buildings that looked like they were leaning into the wind out of sheer exhaustion. Theodore had ridden 3 days from San Antonio to get here, and every one of those days had been hot enough to blister paint. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes set beneath a brow that tended toward seriousness more often than not. He wore a dust-colored trail coat and a flat-brimmed hat that had seen better seasons, and at his hip he carried a Colt revolver he had owned since he was 19, but had never fired at anything more threatening than a rattlesnake. He was not a gunfighter, not a lawman, not a drifter in the usual sense. He was an attorney, or near enough to one, having worked for 3 years in the San Antonio office of a man named Cornelius Briggs, who handled estates and land titles and all the complicated business of what happened to a person's property when they were no longer alive to argue about it. It was the work of Cornelius Briggs's office that had sent Theodore riding north through the heat with a leather satchel strapped across his back, and a legal document folded inside a wax-sealed envelope pressed against his chest in his interior coat pocket, close enough to his heart that he could feel it every time he took a deep breath. The man at the dry goods store, a heavy-set fellow with a grocer's apron and a squint that suggested permanent skepticism, told Theodore that Inez Kendrick lived a mile and a half east of town on the Kendrick farm, such as it was. He said such as it was, with the tone of a man delivering sad news about something that had once been decent and had since fallen into difficult times. He said Inez ran the place mostly alone now, after her mother passed 2 winters back, and that she came into town twice a week for supplies and to post whatever letters she had to post, and that she was generally considered to be a quiet woman who did not invite conversation, but was not unkind when you offered it. Theodore thanked the man, turned his horse east, and followed the dust track out of town. He found the farm without much trouble. It was exactly what the grocer's tone had prepared him for. A modest homestead with a low-roofed house built from weathered timber, a small barn that needed new planks on the south wall, a kitchen garden that was doing its determined best against the drought, and a chicken coop from which a rooster announced his arrival with great authority. There was a well with a wooden cover, a water trough, and a single large cottonwood tree to the east of the house that cast a shadow like a blessing across the dry yard. A woman was coming out of the barn when Theodore pulled his horse to a stop. She was carrying a wooden bucket, and she stopped walking when she saw him, setting the bucket down with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had learned not to be startled by unexpected arrivals, but who was nonetheless paying close attention. Inez Kendrick was 26 years old, though at first glance she might have seemed older simply because of the self-possession she carried in the set of her shoulders and the steadiness of her dark brown eyes. She was not tall, but she stood with a kind of quiet authority that made height seem beside the point. Her hair was the color of strong coffee, pulled back from her face in a practical braid, and her skin was brown and weathered in the particular way of a person who worked outdoors in the Texas sun. She wore a plain work dress in faded blue calico and boots that had been resoled at least once. She looked at Theodore the way a woman looks at a stranger she is still deciding the measure of. "You looking for someone?" she asked. "If you're Inez Kendrick, then I've found who I'm looking for," Theodore said. He touched the brim of his hat. "My name is Theodore Hale. I've ridden from San Antonio on a matter of some legal importance to you personally. I'd be grateful for a few minutes of your time, ma'am, if you can spare them." She studied him for a moment. He had learned in his time working for Cornelius Briggs that people assessed strangers the way they assessed weather, looking for the signs that told them whether to take shelter or go ahead with their plans. Inez Kendrick, he could see, was very good at reading weather. "I'll put my horse up," she said finally, "and you can come in out of the sun. You look half-cooked." He almost smiled at that. "I've been riding since dawn." "I can tell," she said, and picked up her bucket again and walked toward the barn as though the matter were settled. He tied his horse at the post near the trough and let the animal drink while he waited, removing his hat and pressing his forearm across his forehead. The heat was extraordinary even for late June. The sky above was a hard, cloudless blue that offered no mercy. Inside, the house was cool by comparison, cooled by thick walls and small windows, and the shade of that big cottonwood outside. It was a tidy, sparse interior. A kitchen table with 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, a shelf of provisions, a narrow bed visible through an open doorway, a braided rug on the floor, and a framed piece of embroidery on the wall that read, "Be strong and of good courage." There were no luxuries to speak of, but there was a kind of careful order to the place that spoke of a woman who made something out of what she had and wasted nothing. Inez poured water from a clay pitcher into 2 cups and set one in front of him when he sat down at the table. She sat across from him with her own cup and folded her hands on the table and waited. Theodore set his hat on the table beside him, reached into his coat, and removed the sealed envelope. He set it between them but kept his hand near it, not quite pushing it toward her yet, because he had learned that delivering news of this kind required a certain approach, or it landed wrong. "Miss Kendrick," he said, "I need to ask you first whether you ever knew of a man by the name of Elias Rourke." Something moved through her expression, so quick and subtle that he almost missed it. Then it was gone, replaced by careful neutrality. "I do not believe I've ever met a man by that name," she said. "Should I have?" "You wouldn't have met him," Theodore said. "He died 6 weeks ago in San Antonio at the age of 57. He was a rancher and a man of some means, and he left behind a will that contained a specific provision I was instructed to deliver to you in person." He paused. "Before I go further, I need to ask you about your mother, if that's not too painful a subject." "Her name was Clara Kendrick, formerly Clara Morse, before she married." "Is that right?" The stillness that came over Inez Kendrick at the mention of her mother's name was the stillness of a woman who was doing a great deal of thinking very quickly and showing almost none of it. "My mother was Clara Kendrick," she said. "She passed in the winter of 1876. What has she got to do with a man in San Antonio that neither of us ever met?" Theodore took a careful breath. This was always the hardest part of the work. "Miss Kendrick, I believe Elias Rourke was your father." The silence that fell into the room after those words was so complete that Theodore could hear the chickens in the yard outside and the distant sound of the wind moving through the dry grass. Inez did not move. She looked at him with an expression that he could not quite name, because it was made up of too many things happening at once. Her hands remained folded on the table, perfectly still, and her eyes held his with an intensity that made him feel as though he were being measured down to his molecular weight. "That is a significant claim to make," she said finally. Her voice was very even. "Yes," Theodore agreed, "it is. And I want you to understand that I have not come here to cause you pain or to intrude on your private life without good reason. In Mr. Rourke's will, he named you by your full name and gave your mother's name and this town and this farm as your location. He instructed my employer, Mr. Cornelius Briggs, to locate you and deliver to you an inheritance. That envelope contains the legal documents pertaining to that inheritance, but I wanted to speak with you first because this kind of news deserves a human voice, not just a letter." Inez looked at the envelope on the table. She did not reach for it. "How much?" she asked. "I beg your pardon, the inheritance." "How much money did this man leave me?" "It is not only money," Theodore said. There is a sum of $800, which is significant but not extraordinary. The more consequential portion is a parcel of land, 40 acres adjacent to the Rourke Ranch outside San Antonio, with water rights to a year-round creek. The land is already cleared and fenced, and in his will Mr. Rourke specifies that it is to pass to you free and clear of any liens or debts. Inez was quiet for so long that Theodore began to wonder whether she had heard him correctly. 40 acres, she said. With water rights, he confirmed. She stood up from the table so abruptly that her chair scraped back against the wooden floor, and she walked to the small window that looked out over the dry yard, and she stood there with her back to him, her arms crossed over her chest, and she was silent. Theodore waited. He had learned that silence in these moments was the most respectful thing he could offer. After a long while she said, without turning around, "My mother never spoke of him. Not once in my entire life did she mention a man named Elias Rourke. Not his name, not that he existed, not that there was anyone before my father. My father was Thomas Kendrick, and he died of a fever when I was 11 years old. And after that it was just my mother and me running this farm, and she worked herself to nothing keeping us alive, and she never told me." She stopped. He could see from the line of her shoulders that she was holding something very tightly inside herself. "And now this man, this stranger, is dead, and he sends a lawyer to bring me 40 acres and $800, and I am supposed to know what to do with that." "No," Theodore said gently. "You are not supposed to know what to do with it. Not today, and perhaps not for a while. That is entirely normal." She turned from the window then, and he saw that her eyes were bright but her jaw was set, and he understood that she was someone who had learned to cry very privately or not at all, and that she was choosing not to at this moment. "Did he say anything?" she asked. "Did he leave a letter, a word of explanation?" Theodore reached into his satchel and removed a second, smaller envelope. "There is a letter," he said. "He wrote it himself, evidently, and it is addressed to you. I was instructed to deliver it along with the legal documents." He set it on the table gently, as though it might break. "I have not read it. It was sealed by Mr. Rourke himself before his death." She crossed the room and looked at the small envelope for a moment. Then she picked it up and held it in both hands, and something in her face shifted in a way that made Theodore look away, because it felt private in a way he had no right to witness. "Would you be willing to stay a little while?" she asked, and her voice was quieter now, stripped of the careful evenness she had maintained. "I don't mean to impose on your time. I know you've ridden a long way, and I expect you'll want to get back to San Antonio. But I'm not sure I want to read this alone just yet, and I don't have anyone close enough to send for before nightfall." Theodore looked at her. He thought of the long ride back, 3 days of heat and dust and sleeping on the hard ground, and the work waiting for him at Cornelius Briggs's office, and then he thought of the look on her face when she held that letter, and he said, "I'll stay as long as you need me to, Miss Kendrick. I'm in no great rush." She nodded, a small, grateful nod that she seemed to give somewhat against her will, as though accepting help were a thing she had taught herself not to do and was making an exception for. "There's room in the barn for your horse," she said, "and I'll put together something for supper when the evening cools. But first I need to see to the animals, and then I'll read what he had to say for himself." Theodore spent the next hour doing something he had not expected to do when he rode out of San Antonio. He helped a woman he had only just met water her horses, scatter feed for the chickens, and carry 2 sacks of grain from the small supply in her barn to a position closer to the door where they would be easier to access. It was not the work of a lawyer delivering legal documents. But she hadn't asked him for lawyerly services just then. She had asked him to stay, and he had said yes, and it seemed natural to be useful while he was there. They worked mostly without talking, which was comfortable rather than awkward, in the way that silence between people who are both accustomed to hard work can sometimes be. Occasionally she gave him a brief direction: "That gate needs lifting to close right," or "The roan mare is nervous about strangers. Best let her come to you first." And he followed these directions without argument, because she knew her farm and he was a guest in it. The sun moved lower in the sky, and the heat eased from brutal to merely fierce, and they went back inside, and she put a pot of beans on the stove and sliced cornbread she had baked that morning, and then she sat down at the table with the small envelope in her hands. She opened it carefully, as though she had decided to treat it with a respect she was not entirely sure the writer deserved. Theodore sat in the other chair and kept his eyes on the table, giving her what privacy he could in the small room. He heard the paper unfold. He heard her breathing change once sharply and then settle. He heard the small sounds of her reading, the slight shifts in her chair, the single low exhale that might have been disbelief or grief or something that had no clean name. It took her a long time. When she set the letter down, she smoothed it flat on the table with her palm in a gesture that seemed almost involuntary, and she stared at the wall above his head for a moment. "He was in love with my mother," she said, "when she was 17 and he was 24. He says he was working on her father's farm in Abilene as a hired hand. He says they were planning to marry, but that her family disapproved. His words are that her father made it clear in no uncertain terms that a girl of Clara Morse's standing would not be permitted to throw herself away on a man with no land and no prospects." She paused. "He says he left Abilene intending to prove himself and come back for her, and that by the time he had built something worth returning with, she had already married Thomas Kendrick and moved to Harlan Creek, and he was too proud or too cowardly. He says it himself, too proud or too cowardly to put himself in the way of a married woman's life." She stopped again. "He says he did not know about me. He says he found out only 3 years ago, through a letter someone had saved from my mother to a friend, that there had been a child born earlier than a certain calendar would have explained to those who calculated these things, and that he had spent the last 3 years trying to work out whether the child was his and what to do about it." She pressed her palm flat against the letter again. "He says he is sorry. He says he never stopped thinking of her. He says he hopes the land gives me something firm to stand on." The room was very quiet. Outside, the evening wind had come up and was moving through the cottonwood tree in long, soft sounds. "He had a whole life in San Antonio," Theodore said carefully. "His own ranch, his own work. Did he say whether he married, had other family?" "He never married," she said. "He says it plainly. He says he could never quite manage it." She looked at the letter once more, then folded it along its original creases and held it in her lap. "I can't decide whether that makes it more sad or less." "Probably both," Theodore offered. She looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time since they had come inside, and something in her expression shifted into a kind of cautious openness, as though she had made a quiet internal decision to allow him a measure of trust. "What was he like?" she asked. "Did you know him personally?" "I met him once," Theodore said, "when he came into our office to draw up the will about a year ago. He was a tall man, broad through the chest, quiet. He sat across from Mr. Briggs and me and answered every question with the precision of someone who had thought a great deal about what he wanted to say and was not going to be rushed. He had a way of sitting very still, very deliberately." He paused and added, not quite meaning to, "You have that quality too." Inez looked at him for a moment, and he expected her to dismiss the observation or change the subject, but instead she said, "I always wondered where I got it from. My mother could never sit still for 5 minutes together." They ate supper as the last of the light faded from the sky, and they talked, slowly at first, then with growing ease, the way people sometimes talk when the pressure of formality has been lifted by shared difficulty. Theodore told her about his work in San Antonio, about Cornelius Briggs, about the nature of estate work, and how he had been uncertain at first whether it suited him. A man who had grown up on a small cattle operation north of Austin, and had gotten his legal education through a combination of reading law in a borrowed office, and 2 years at a college in Houston that had tested his patience on a daily basis. He told her about his mother, still living on the cattle operation, sharp and opinionated and perpetually concerned that he was not eating enough, and she smiled at that, a small but genuine smile that he found himself wanting to earn again. She told him in return about the farm, about her mother and the two of them holding it together after Thomas Kendrick died, about learning to do the work that her father had done, because there was no one else to do it, about the 2 winters that had been so hard she had considered giving up the farm and moving into town to find work, but had stayed because the land was the one thing left that was hers. She told him about the drought that was now in its 2nd year and what it was doing to the soil, about the neighbors to the north, the Garza family, who had been more than neighborly through the difficult seasons and whose daughter Maria had been her closest friend since childhood. She did not cry, not in front of him. But there were moments in the evening where she went still and quiet in a particular way, and he recognized it as the look of someone whose grief was not absent, but was being kept on a very short lead, and he respected it. When the supper things were cleared, she said he was welcome to use the barn loft for sleeping, that it was better than the ground and she had extra blankets. He thanked her and said that was more than enough. Before he went out to the barn, he paused at the door. "Miss Kendrick," he said, "if it would be of any use to you, I am in no urgent need to return to San Antonio for the next few days. Mr. Briggs understood this might require some time. If you have questions about the legal documents, or about the land, or about anything else related to the estate, I am available to answer them. And if you simply want someone nearby while you work through this, well, I find I'm not much minding the time." She was standing at the table, her hands resting on the back of a chair, and she looked at him with an expression that was complex in a way he didn't try to untangle. "I'd appreciate that," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." "Theodore," he said, "or Theo if you prefer. Mr. Hale makes me think someone needs legal assistance." Something shifted in her eyes that was the beginning of humor. "Theo," she repeated, as though testing whether it suited. "Good night, Theo." "Good night, Miss Kendrick," he said, and went out into the cool Texas night and stood for a moment under the stars, which were brilliant and innumerable above the dark prairie, and felt something he had not felt in quite some time. The specific alertness of a person who is exactly where they ought to be without quite knowing why. The next morning broke pink and gold over the eastern plains, and Theodore was up before Inez, tending his horse and carrying water from the well the way he would have done on his mother's cattle operation, without making a thing of it. When Inez came out of the house, she found him already at work, and she stopped on the step and looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read from where he stood. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She looked at him another moment, then went to get the feed for the chickens without further comment, and he understood that she had accepted this in the way she accepted most things, with a minimum of words and a quiet acknowledgement that reality was what it was. After breakfast, she brought out the legal documents from the envelope and they sat at the table together, and he walked her through each one, explaining the language, the land description, the conditions of the deed, the terms of the bank transfer in San Antonio, where the $800 was held in an account bearing her name. He explained it carefully and without condescension, and she listened with the attention of someone who understood that documents were power, and that not understanding them was a way of losing that power to people who did. She asked precise questions. What were the water rights exactly, and were they contested? No, he told her, they were clear. Were there any liens against the land she was inheriting? None. What would she need to do to formally take possession? Sign 3 documents in front of a witness, which could be Theodore himself for 2 of them and would require a notary for the 3rd, and there was a notary in town, a man named Harper who ran the post office. "And the money?" she asked. "It can be transferred to any bank you name, or withdrawn in full from the San Antonio Bank, once the estate documents are executed. That will take approximately 2 to 3 weeks from the time you sign." She nodded slowly, looking at the documents spread across the table. Then she said, 40 acres with water rights beside a ranch in San Antonio. "Yes. "What would you do with it?" she asked, and the question was direct, not rhetorical. He thought about it honestly. "If it were mine, I'd see it first before I decided anything. Land means different things depending on whether you've stood on it and looked at it. But if it was good land with water, and I had a farm here that was struggling in a drought, I would consider whether the land in San Antonio could be made to work harder for me than this land is able to at present." She looked at him. "Are you suggesting I sell this farm and move to San Antonio?" "I'm not suggesting anything," he said. "Ask me what I would do. I'm telling you what I might consider, which is not the same as telling you what to do. This is your farm and your decision, and I have no stake in it." "You have a stake in getting me to sign the documents so you can go home," she said, but there was no bite in it, just observation. "Even that stake," he said, "is not large enough to make me steer you wrong. I told you I had time, and I meant it." She was quiet, tapping the edge of one document lightly against the table. "I'd like to sleep on it," she said. "Not the signing I'll sign today, no reason to delay that, but the rest of it, what to do with what he's given me." "That's wise," he said. They went to the post office that afternoon, and Harper the notary, a thin, pleasant man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and a manner of relentless cheerfulness, witnessed and notarized the relevant document while asking Theodore no fewer than 4 questions about his journey from San Antonio and commenting extensively on the drought, on the cattle prices, and on the recent news that the railroad might be coming within 20 miles of Harlan Creek, which he seemed to consider the most significant event of the decade. Theodore answered each inquiry with patience, and Inez stood beside him with the look of a woman who had known Harper for years and had long since made peace with his particular nature. When it was done and they were back in the street outside the post office, walking toward where their horses were tied, Inez stopped walking and turned to look at the town around her. Theodore stopped too. The main street of Harlan Creek was dusty and quiet in the afternoon heat, a handful of people moving about their business, a dog sleeping in the shade of the general store's porch, the sound of a hammer somewhere in the distance. "I've lived here my whole life," she said. "My mother's grave is here. Maria Garza is here. Everything I know is here." "I know," Theodore said, "but this land is failing," she said more quietly. 2 years of drought and I've already sold the larger of my 2 horses because I couldn't feed them both. The kitchen garden is half what it should be. I've been buying more provisions than I'm growing and my savings are thin." She paused. "If the drought doesn't break this year, I'm going to have to make a decision anyway." "Then at least now you have options," Theodore said. She looked at him sidelong. "Is that what this is, a gift of options?" "I think," he said carefully, "that a man who spent 30 years carrying guilt about a woman and a daughter he never knew probably wanted to give you something that could not be taken away easily. Land with water in Texas is about as close to permanent security as most people can manage." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You speak of him with some sympathy." "I met him once," Theodore said. "He didn't seem like a bad man. He seemed like a man who had made a mistake he could never entirely forgive himself for and had spent a long time living with it. That's not unusual. It's just usually less visible." Inez started walking again, slowly. "I'm angry," she said, as though this were a small admission she was making to herself as much as to him. "I want to be clear about that. I'm angry at him for never coming, even when he knew or suspected. I'm angry at my mother for not telling me even once that there had been someone before my father who had mattered. I'm angry that I have spent 26 years not knowing something that is apparently a significant fact about who I am." She paused. "But I am also, I don't know." There is something else underneath the anger, something that isn't ready to be named yet. "Grief," Theodore said, "for the father you didn't have, for the man you can't now meet and ask your questions to. For the version of your mother you thought you knew." She stopped walking again and she looked at him fully, and the expression on her face was complicated and open and slightly unguarded in a way that he understood was not her usual habit. "You're good at this," she said, "for a lawyer." "I've done it a few times," he said. "The delivering of news that changes things. You get better at it or you get numb to it. I'd rather be better at it." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she started walking again, and they walked back to where the horses were tied in companionable silence. Over the days that followed, Theodore found himself settling into the rhythms of the Kendrick farm with an ease that surprised him, though he was careful not to make himself so comfortable that he became a burden or an imposition. He helped where help was useful, and stayed out of the way where it was not. He fixed the loose plank on the south wall of the barn with timber from a pile of salvage in the back corner, because he had noticed it needed doing and he had the skills. He helped carry water during the evening chores. He rode with Inez when she went to check on the small herd of 4 cattle she kept in the east pasture, riding alongside her across the dry grassland while she pointed out the places where the grass had given up entirely and the hard earth showed through. The Garza farm was a mile to the north, and on the second afternoon, Inez's friend Maria rode over with a basket of chilies from her mother's garden and a very frank curiosity about the stranger staying at the Kendrick place. Maria Garza was 24, small and vivid, with dark eyes that took in everything at once, and a manner of speaking that was direct to the point of cheerfulness. She looked Theodore over with undisguised assessment when they were introduced, gave Inez a look of communicative intent that Theodore pretended not to notice, and stayed for 2 hours, during which time she managed to extract from Theodore his age, his place of origin, his profession, whether he had sisters, and what he thought about the cattle market, while simultaneously updating Inez on every piece of news from the surrounding farms and the town. When Maria had gone, Inez was quiet for a moment and then said, without looking at him, "She is going to tell her mother, and then the entire county will know there is a man staying at my farm." "Does that concern you?" Theodore asked. She considered this. "It would have concerned my mother," she said. "My mother cared a great deal about what people said. I find I care less and less as I get older. I could stay at the hotel in town if you prefer." "I didn't say I wanted you to go," she said, and then she seemed to realize how that had sounded, and she turned to look at the horses with a studied interest that suggested she was buying herself a moment. Theodore looked in the same direction and said nothing, but he was aware of a warmth in his chest that had been growing quietly since the first evening when she had asked him to stay, and he was beginning to understand what it meant, though he was not yet sure what to do about it. On the 4th day, Inez suggested they ride into town to get supplies, and she also told him, with a practical directness that he was coming to recognize as characteristic of her, that she had been thinking about the land in San Antonio, and that she would like to hear his honest opinion on whether he thought it was worth making the journey to see it before deciding anything. "Honest opinion," he said as they rode the dust track toward town. "Yes, I think you should see it. 40 acres with water rights is not a small thing, and I would not want you to make a decision about property without seeing it, any more than you would buy a horse without looking at it first." "That's a very practical view," she said. "I'm a practical person," he said. "Mostly." She glanced at him. "Mostly. There are areas of my life where I have not been entirely practical," he allowed. She didn't pursue it, and he was somewhat relieved, because the area he was thinking of had to do with the fact that he had been here 4 days, and had stopped thinking about returning to San Antonio as a thing he particularly wanted to rush toward. In town, they tied up outside the general store, and while Inez went in to speak with Mr. Alderman, the shopkeeper, about her account and her provisions, Theodore walked down to the small hotel to check whether there were any telegrams or messages waiting for him from Cornelius Briggs's office. There was indeed a telegram from Briggs, asking for a brief update on the matter, and indicating there was no great hurry, but that a reply when convenient would be appreciated. Theodore composed a brief reply indicating that the documents had been signed and notarized, and that the beneficiary was in the process of considering her options regarding the property, and that he expected to be returning to San Antonio within the week. He gave the telegram to the hotel clerk, who would pass it to the telegraph office, and he stood outside for a moment on the hotel porch looking down the street toward the general store. Within the week. He had written it reflexively, the reasonable professional time frame, the kind of language that belonged in a telegram to an employer. And then he had stood there in the afternoon heat thinking about it with something close to reluctance. The thought came to him clearly, without fanfare. He did not want to leave. He turned this thought over, examining it for rationality, because he was a man who believed in examining his impulses. He had known Inez Kendrick for 4 days. She was a woman managing a difficult situation, with a composure and intelligence that he found deeply admirable. She was also, he was aware, in the middle of processing a grief that was complicated and fresh, and he was the person who had delivered that grief to her door, which was not exactly the foundation most people would choose for romantic feeling. And yet, he walked back to the general store, because standing on a porch arguing with himself was not a constructive use of the afternoon. Inez was coming out as he arrived, carrying a paper parcel and a small tin, and she looked up at him with a calm inquiry. "Was there news from your office?" she asked. "Mr. Briggs checking in," he said. I replied that things were in order and that I'd be heading back within the week. She nodded, and he watched her face for something, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. What he saw was a brief, controlled stillness that might have been nothing, and then she said, "That makes sense," and handed him the tin of salt pork to carry and walked toward the horses. He carried the tin and thought about whether that stillness had meant anything at all. That evening after supper, they sat on the narrow porch of the house in the relative cool of the later hours, and the sky above was enormous and full of stars, the way it only gets in flat country far from any city, and the cottonwood made its soft sounds in the wind, and for a long while they were simply quiet together, which had by now become a thing that neither of them found uncomfortable. "Will you go back?" she asked. Not about San Antonio, she meant the land. He understood immediately. "To Harlan Creek after seeing the land. That depends entirely on what you find when you get there," he said. "Some people look at a piece of land and feel something, and some people look at it and feel nothing, and there is no predicting which you'll be until you stand on it. I meant what I said about this land," she said. "My mother's grave is here, Maria is here, everything I know. Those things matter," he said. "They matter a great deal. But you also said options are a gift." "They are." She turned her head to look at him. They were sitting in 2 plain wooden chairs, close enough that he was aware of the warmth of her in the night air. "Why did you stay?" she asked. It was direct, in the way she was always direct. "I asked you to stay for a little while, and you've been here 4 days helping with the farm work and talking through estate documents and eating my cornbread. You don't have to be here, Theo. What's keeping you?" He looked at her. He had been expecting the question or something like it, and he had thought about what answer would be honest without being premature. He found, facing her in the dark, that the careful answer he had prepared did not quite cover what was true. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "I've delivered estates before. I've sat with people while they read difficult letters, and I've explained legal documents, and I've ridden back to San Antonio and gone on with my work, and I've never once wanted to stay." He paused. "I want to stay here. I don't entirely know what to do with that, because you're dealing with something large and I don't want to add to the complexity of your life. But I'm not going to lie to you about why I'm still here." The silence afterward was very still. Inez looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her turning the words over, testing their weight and their truth. "I don't know what to do with it either," she said at last. "I'll tell you that plainly. My life has had a great deal happen to it in the last 4 days, and I'm still finding my footing. But I'm not without feelings in this matter. I want you to know that." She paused, and he could see that the admission cost her something, not because it was untrue, but because she was not accustomed to saying these things out loud. "I'd like more time," she said. "Not to string you along or be unfair to you. Just to find out if this is real or if it's a result of everything being turned upside down at once." "That is one of the most sensible things anyone has ever said to me," Theodore said. She exhaled a small breath that might have been a laugh, barely audible. "I'm a sensible person," she said. "Mostly." He smiled at that because it was his word returned to him, and she had meant it that way, and that small shared thing felt warmer than it had any right to. "Then stay," she said. "If you can manage it with Mr. Briggs, stay a while longer and we'll see what we see." He sent another telegram to Cornelius Briggs the following morning, this one explaining that there were additional matters requiring his attention related to the estate and that he anticipated requiring 2 more weeks on site. Briggs replied within the day with a brevity that Theodore had learned to read as benign. "As you see fit. Keep me informed." The next 2 weeks were, for Theodore Hale, the most vivid of his adult life. They fell into days that had the quality of something being built, careful and solid, one thing upon another. He had ridden out to the Garza farm with her the following Sunday, where he met Maria's parents, Eduardo and Rosario Garza, who had farmed this land for 20 years and who received him with a cautious warmth that he understood had to be earned and not assumed. Eduardo Garza was a man who had come north from Mexico as a young man and had built his farm with his own hands and had navigated 20 years of a territory that had not always been welcoming, and he assessed strangers the way a careful man assesses tools, for whether they would hold up under pressure. Theodore, who had grown up working alongside Mexican and black ranch hands on his mother's cattle operation, and who had none of the contempt that some men of his era carried without even noticing, found that Eduardo Garza was a man he could talk to honestly about land, about water, about the particular injustice of a territory that had been Mexican land living memory ago, and was now administered by laws and courts that often treated its original inhabitants as afterthoughts. It was not a short conversation, and by the end of it Eduardo had offered him a second cup of coffee, which Theodore understood to be a form of acceptance. On the ride home, Inez said, "He likes you." "I liked him," Theodore said. "Not everyone makes the effort to listen to what Eduardo has to say about this land and what came before. A lot of men in this county think the history started when they got here. That kind of thinking makes people stupid about the places they live," Theodore said. "I was raised not to be stupid about it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Where did you say your mother's cattle operation was?" "North of Austin. Small operation. She runs it with 2 hands now, good men, one of whom has been with her for 15 years. She's very capable." "She sounds like it," Inez said, and there was something warm in her voice when she said it. In the evenings, they talked. They talked about everything, with the thoroughness of 2 people who were simultaneously getting to know each other and getting to know themselves better through the comparison. They talked about books. He had a small collection he carried in his saddlebag, and she had a shelf of 6 that she had read enough times to quote, and they found that they had strong and sometimes opposing opinions about the same novels, which led to a discussion one evening that became unexpectedly heated before they both realized they were laughing. They talked about the law, about what it was supposed to do and what it frequently failed to do, and she had sharp, clear opinions on this that surprised him with their precision, until he remembered that she had spent 15 years running a farm and managing a legal title and dealing with the county land office, and was not, in fact, someone who had been sheltered from the way systems worked. They talked about the drought and the cattle market, and whether the railroad coming within 20 miles would change anything for Harlan Creek, and they talked about her mother, slowly, in pieces, the way you can only talk about grief that is still in the process of being understood. One afternoon they rode east together, far enough from the farm that the buildings disappeared behind the land's low curve, and stopped at the top of a small rise where the wind came through clean and strong, and the grassland ran out in every direction to a horizon that felt like the edge of the world. She sat easy on her horse, the roan mare, who had indeed decided Theodore was acceptable and looked out at all of it, and he watched her face. "I think about him sometimes," she said, meaning Elias Rourke. "I think about him building his ranch down in San Antonio, and never coming back and carrying it alone all those years. And I think about my mother working this farm and never saying a word." She paused. Do you think she was ashamed? Of what? Theodore asked carefully. Of having loved him, of having a child before she was married to my father. I think, Theodore said slowly, that in 1851 in Abilene, a girl of 17 having loved a hired hand and gotten herself into an unfortunate situation would have had very good reasons to keep it quiet for the rest of her life. Not because she should have been ashamed, but because the world she lived in would not have been kind to either of you if the truth had been known. Inez was quiet, looking at the horizon. That's very true, she said. And it makes me both sad for her and still a little bit angry because she could have told me when I was old enough, when it was just the two of us and there was no one left to hurt. Maybe she didn't know how to say it after so long, Theodore said. Sometimes the longer a truth is kept, the heavier it becomes, and the harder it gets to put down without everything shifting. She turned to look at him. The wind was moving her hair loose from its braid. You have a lot of patience for human failing. I have a lot of experience watching it, he said, and not just in other people. She tilted her head slightly, a question. I've made my share of mistakes, he said. Mostly of the kind where you know what the right thing to do is and you do the wrong thing anyway because the right thing is hard. I don't think I have much standing to be hard on people for that. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, What's the worst thing you ever did? He was surprised by the question and she saw it and almost smiled. You don't have to answer, she said. I'm curious by nature. Maria says it's my most annoying quality. No, it's fair, he said. I'll answer it. He thought for a moment, genuinely. When I was 23, I was engaged to a woman in Houston. We were engaged for a year and I ended it 3 months before the wedding because I realized I wasn't in love with her and I never had been, and I had been telling myself a story about how love would develop in time. He paused. It was the right decision, but I did it badly. I was not brave enough to do it earlier when it would have hurt less, and I was not kind enough when I finally did it. I told myself I was being merciful and I was actually being cowardly, and she was hurt more than she needed to be because of my cowardice. Inez looked at him for a long moment. Did she recover? She married a good man from Galveston the following year, he said. She seemed happy from all accounts. That doesn't excuse what I did, but it was a relief to know she was all right. You've thought about it a lot, she said. It was not an accusation, just an observation. Yes, he said. They sat on the rise in the wind for a little while longer, and then they turned their horses back toward the farm, and the sun was on their shoulders and the distance between their horses had somehow narrowed, though neither of them had made a conscious move. It was at the end of the first week of the second 2 weeks, on a Tuesday, that the event happened which Theodore would later think of as the moment when all the careful ground that had been building between them became undeniable. He had gone into town alone that morning to collect some items from the general store and to reply to a second message from Cornelius Briggs about an unrelated estate matter that required his written instructions. He was coming back along the dust track when he heard the sound that every person in Texas cattle country knew and dreaded. The dry, unmistakable rattle of disturbed rattlesnake, very close, and then his horse shying hard to the left so fast that it nearly unseated him. The snake was large and it was in the middle of the track, coiled and furious, and his horse was not having any part of it. Theodore spent several long seconds managing 1,200 pounds of terrified horse, with one hand on the reins and the other trying to keep himself in the saddle. And by the time the horse had settled down enough to be steered off the track and around the snake at a very wide angle, his heart was hammering, and he was considerably dustier than before. He arrived back at the farm somewhat disheveled and with his nerves still registering the event, and when Inez came out of the barn and looked at him, at the dust on his coat, the slight unsteadiness in his dismount, the expression on his face that he was aware was less composed than usual, she said, "What happened?" With the quick, direct concern of someone who went immediately to action when there was a problem. He told her, with a slight laugh at himself, because it was fine and had ended without incident, and she listened, And when he was finished, she came and took the reins of his horse from him in the casual, practiced way she did everything with animals, and she looked at him with an expression that was careful and warm. "Are you all right?" she asked, and the question was simple and quiet, not alarmed, just genuinely asking. "I'm fine," he said, a little shaken. "The horse did most of the dangerous work." "You stayed on," she said. "That takes some doing when a horse goes sideways like that." 15 years of riding, he said. She was looking up at him. He was a few inches taller with that expression, and he was aware, not for the first time but more forcibly than before, of how near she was, and of how much he wanted to close the distance between them, and of how much care he had been taking not to, because he had meant what he said about not wanting to complicate things for her. "I'm glad you're all right," she said, just that. But the way she said it, quietly and directly, without any buffer or qualification, went straight past all his careful restraint and landed somewhere central. "Inez," he said. She looked at him. "I want to be very honest with you," he said, "because you deserve honesty and because I think you'd find anything less extremely irritating." The corner of her mouth moved. "Go ahead." "I am in a significant amount of danger of being entirely in love with you," he said. "I am telling you this not because I expect you to do anything about it right now, but because I told you I would be honest, and that includes this." He paused. "You asked for time, and I still mean to give you time. I'm not saying this to pressure you. I'm saying it because you asked me why I was staying, and I gave you a partial answer, and I think you deserve the full one." She was very still in the way she got still when she was thinking hard. She held his horse's reins in both hands, and she looked at him, and he watched the things moving through her expression. The careful weighing, the guarded hope, the complex freight of a person who had been largely alone for a long time and had learned not to need things. "Significant danger," she repeated. "I have some legal training," he said. "I try to be precise about these things." And then she laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the first time he had heard it without qualification or caution, and the sound of it was such a complete and beautiful thing that he stood there in the afternoon heat feeling something move through him like the first rain after a long drought. She looked at him after the laugh had settled, and her expression was open in a way he hadn't seen before. "Give me my time," she said, "but don't go to San Antonio just yet." "I won't," he said. The following days had a different quality to them, as though something that had been held in careful suspension had been allowed to settle into its natural state. They were not dramatically different days from what had come before. There was still farm work and legal discussion, and supper cooking and evening sitting on the porch. But the air between them had changed, and they both knew it, and the knowledge of it meant that ordinary things carried an extra weight of meaning. The way she handed him the coffee cup in the morning had become specific. The way he came to stand beside her at the fence in the evenings had become intentional rather than habitual. And the conversations they had now occasionally became the kind where one or the other of them said something that required a moment of quiet to absorb. He rode with her to the cemetery east of town on a Thursday afternoon, because she had said she was going to visit her mother's grave and he had offered to come, and she had said yes without hesitation. Clara Kendrick's grave was modest, a wooden marker, neatly lettered, with a small border of stones Inez had placed there herself. It was in the middle section of the cemetery, among other ordinary Harlan Creek graves, and Inez stood before it for a long time with her hat in her hands. Theodore stood a respectful distance back, giving her the space of it, watching the wind move through the grass around the graves. After a while, Inez said, without turning around, "I talked to her here after she died. When things were very hard the first winter alone, I'd come out here and just talk." She paused. "I don't know what to say today." "Maybe you don't have to say anything," Theodore said. "Maybe it's enough to just stand here." She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, "I forgive you. That's what I have to say to her today. I don't fully understand it yet, but I forgive you. I think that's the beginning." Theodore did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would be better than the silence, so he stayed in the silence with her, and the wind moved through the grass, and the afternoon was very golden and still. On the way back, they rode slowly, and at a certain point, without planning it, their horses came up alongside each other close enough that their knees nearly touched, and neither of them moved away, and they rode like that most of the way back to the farm, with the long grass on either side turning gold in the late light, and it was one of the finest things Theodore could remember in a long time. That evening he told her about the land in San Antonio again, not as a legal matter but as a practical one. He described what he remembered of the land from the description in the documents, the way it sat along the creek, the kind of soil it was, the trees along the water. He described San Antonio itself, the city, the mix of people, the old Spanish missions, the markets, the way it was different from any other place in Texas. "It's not Harlan Creek," he said. "It's noisier and bigger and more complicated, but it has things that a city has that a small town doesn't." "Like what?" she asked. "Schools if you ever needed them, doctors, more than one store, people from more places." He paused. "A law office where a man could make a reasonable living." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "That last thing," she said slowly, "is that relevant information?" "It might be," he said, "depending on what the next few weeks look like." "Theo," she set down her cup, "are you asking me something?" "I'm laying a foundation," he said carefully. "I'm a man who works in legal documents, and I understand the importance of establishing facts before making an argument." "What's the argument?" she asked. She was looking at him steadily, the way she always did, without flinching, and he found himself grateful for it, because it meant he did not have to be anything other than what he was. "The argument," he said, "is that I would like, if you are amenable, to come back to Harlan Creek after I return to San Antonio to settle my affairs there, with the intention of staying longer than a legal errand requires, and that I would like, in the meantime, for us to write to each other, because I have found that you say things in the course of a day that I want to think about for the rest of the day, and then for several days after, and I would like to continue having access to those things." She was quiet for a moment, but her eyes were warm. "You'd come back," she said. "Yes, to Harlan Creek. Or," he said, "to wherever you decide to go, San Antonio if you take the land. Here if you stay, somewhere else entirely if you find you want something different. I'm not trying to decide anything for you. I'm trying to tell you that my direction is toward you, and I'd like to know if that's welcome." The silence that followed was the particular silence of two people standing at a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. "It's welcome," she said. Her voice was quiet and sure. He exhaled, slow and steady, and felt something in his chest that was not anxiety or restraint but simply warmth, the clean, uncomplicated warmth of something that was going to be all right. "Then I'll write when I get to San Antonio," he said. "I'll write back," she said. "I'm told I write a tolerable letter." "I have no doubt of it." They looked at each other for a moment longer, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly, just the press of her fingers against his knuckles for a moment, warm and deliberate, and then she withdrew it and picked up her coffee cup again, and the night continued, and the stars were brilliant outside, and the cottonwood made its long soft sound in the wind. Theodore left Harlan Creek 3 days later, on a morning that was hot but not brutally so, with a slight breeze from the north that made the ride easier than the one that had brought him in. He had said his goodbyes the evening before to the Garzas, who had come for supper and who had been warm and genuine in their send-off, in the way of people who had accepted him. Inez walked with him to where his horse was ready in the yard. She had packed him provisions for the road: cornbread wrapped in cloth, a tin of salted meat, dried apricots from a supply that he knew she had rationed carefully, and he accepted the food with a feeling that was larger than the words available to describe it. "Write to me when you get there," she said. She was standing in the morning light with her arms at her sides, her braid over one shoulder, and she looked exactly like herself, which was to say she looked like a woman who was clear-eyed and practical and quietly brave, and he thought that if he lived to be very old he would remember this exact image with extraordinary clarity. "The day I arrive," he promised. She nodded. And then, because they were both people who tended toward directness when it mattered, she stepped forward and he stepped forward and she kissed him on the cheek, warm and brief and certain, and stepped back again. "Come back," she said. "Nothing is going to stop me," he said. He rode south into the morning, and he did not look back for a long time, because looking back when you were certain of returning was a thing you did when you needed to reassure yourself, and he did not need reassurance. He was coming back. He was as sure of it as he had been sure of anything in his life. He arrived in San Antonio 7 days later, having ridden carefully in the heat. Cornelius Briggs's office was on Commerce Street, a narrow, well-organized room above a land surveyor's office, and Briggs himself was a small, precise man of 62, who listened to Theodore's report on the Kendrick estate with the attention of someone who was simultaneously processing legal information and personal subtext, and was too professional to comment directly on the latter. He commented indirectly. 2 weeks on site for a routine estate delivery is somewhat longer than our usual practice, he observed, over the case file. The beneficiary required additional time to process the circumstances, Theodore said, in his most professional voice. Said Briggs, which was a syllable that could mean many things when he used it. Theodore sat down at his desk and wrote Inez a letter that same evening. A long one, longer than he had planned, covering the journey back, a description of the city in the evening light, a question about the roan mare and the kitchen garden and Maria Garza's opinion on the recent cattle prices, and the honest statement that the office felt considerably smaller than it had before he left, without being able to fully account for the change. Her first letter arrived 11 days later, carried up from the post office by the boy who did the rounds. It was 4 pages in a clear, economical hand, and it covered the farm, the first sign of rain on the eastern horizon that had given her some cautious hope, a discussion of something Eduardo Garza had said about the dry season that she found worth repeating, and a report on Maria's opinion of Theodore, which was, according to Inez, positive overall but with reservations about his penmanship, which I cannot speak to as I have not yet seen his writing. He read the letter twice and then sat back in his chair and thought about things. He wrote back that day. The correspondence between them became, over the following 6 weeks, the organizing center of Theodore's days in a way that he recognized as both slightly ridiculous and entirely real. He arranged his work with an efficiency that his employer found unexpectedly impressive, clearing the backlog on 3 cases and making substantive progress on 2 land title matters that had been sitting on his desk for months, largely because he was motivated to create space in his schedule that could eventually become a departure. He also made inquiries, quiet and professional, about whether the legal practice in San Antonio would benefit from a man who was familiar with both estate law and land title work if that man were to relocate to Harlan Creek and establish a small practice. The county seat that administered Harlan Creek was large enough to have need for such services, and Cornelius Briggs, when Theodore finally had the conversation with him directly, was more understanding than Theodore had quite expected. "I've been watching you work for 3 years, Briggs said, with his usual economy. "You're a good lawyer, but you're not a city lawyer. You've always worked best when the work means something to a specific person. I think you'll do well somewhere smaller." He paused. "Is she a sensible woman?" Theodore thought about Inez Kendrick's precise, measured handling of the legal documents and her clear-eyed assessment of her own situation and her capacity to forgive things she had every right to be angry about, and the way she had kissed him on the cheek with the certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. "Very," he said. "Good," said Briggs. "Bring her back through San Antonio if she comes to see the land. I'd like to meet her." Inez's letters, meanwhile, had taken on their own momentum. She was direct and clear in writing as she was in person, but writing gave her a slightly different register, slightly more reflective, and her letters began to reveal things that their daily farm conversations had not fully covered. what she had thought about in the weeks before Theodore arrived, the particular quality of the loneliness that came from being a capable person in difficult circumstances rather than an incapable one, the long, careful way she had rebuilt her confidence after her mother died, and the farm was hers alone to manage. She wrote about the letter from Elias Rourke, which she had read 3 more times since Theodore left, and about how her anger was softening not into forgiveness exactly but into something more like understanding, and how understanding was its own kind of relief. She wrote, in the 4th letter, "I did not expect to feel the change that I feel since you came and left. I am not sure I have adequate language for it. I will say that the farm is still the same farm, and the drought is still the drought, and Maria is still Maria. But all of these things feel differently weighted somehow, as though someone has adjusted the calibration of some instrument I have been using my whole life, and I am still getting accustomed to the new readings." He read this letter in Cornelius Briggs's office on a Tuesday afternoon, and he read it 3 times, and then he went home and started composing his reply, which ended with, "I believe I know exactly what you mean. I have been experiencing a similar recalibration for the better part of 2 months. If it continues at this rate, I expect by the time I arrive back in Harlan Creek, the instrument will require entirely new measurements." He rode back to Harlan Creek in October, when the worst of the summer heat had given way to the clear, hard blue of a Texas autumn, and he had settled his affairs with Briggs's office, made arrangements for the appropriate legal filings to practice in the county, and packed his 2 saddlebags and the single trunk he owned with everything that mattered and put the rest in storage. He arrived in the late afternoon, when the light was long and amber, and the shadows of the fence posts stretched halfway across the yard. He could see from the road that the kitchen garden had recovered somewhat since the hint of rain she had mentioned in her letters, and the barn had new planks on the south wall, which he noticed with a particular feeling, because he had been the one to start that repair in August. Inez came out of the house when she heard the horse. She was wearing a blue dress he hadn't seen before, not a work dress but not formal either, and she stood on the step with her arms at her sides and looked at him as he dismounted, and her face was the face of a person who had been waiting and was now done waiting and was glad of it. "You came back," she said. "I told you nothing was going to stop me," he said. She walked down from the step and across the yard to him, and he walked toward her, and when they were close she looked up at him with the clear, direct look she had given him on the first day when she was still deciding whether to trust him, except now there was no uncertainty in it, only the simple, complete openness of someone who had made her decision and was at peace with it. He kissed her, properly this time, not on the cheek, and she kissed him back with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything she did, and the amber afternoon light was all around them, and the cottonwood was making its long, soft sound overhead. After a moment they stepped back and looked at each other. "Come inside," she said. "There's coffee on and Maria is coming for supper and she is going to be insufferably pleased about all of this." "I don't mind insufferable pleasure from people who care about you," he said. She looked at him, a smile coming up that was warm and unguarded. "You are going to fit here very well," she said, and took his hand and led him inside. Maria was indeed insufferably pleased. She arrived an hour later with a basket from her mother's kitchen, and one look at Theodore and Inez in the small house and the particular manner in which they occupied the same space, and she set her basket down on the table and put her hands on her hips and said, "I knew it. Didn't I say? The day he arrived, I told my mother, I said that man is not going anywhere fast, watch and see." "You said you had reservations about his penmanship," Inez reminded her. "That was before I read his letter," Maria said. "Rosario made me read it because Inez had mentioned it, and Rosario said any man who writes 4 pages to say he is coming back is worth keeping." She turned to Theodore. "My mother has invited you both for Sunday dinner. She will not take no." "I would be very glad to come," Theodore said. Maria smiled at him with the satisfaction of someone watching a plan of her own devising come to its natural conclusion, and Inez caught Theodore's eye over Maria's head with an expression that was fond and exasperated and completely happy. Theodore established his legal practice in the county seat over the following months, riding the 20 miles to the seat 3 times a week and working from Inez's kitchen table on the other days, building the kind of small but steady practice that a rural county needed. Property disputes, estate work, the occasional contract matter, and the particular work of helping people who had land claims that the county administration had not correctly registered, which was a more common problem than it should have been in this part of Texas, and one he worked on with an energy that came from genuine conviction. The drought broke in November. Not dramatically, not in one storm, but in a series of steady November rains that came on the back of a cool front and soaked into the cracked earth with the patience of water reclaiming its rights. Inez stood in the yard in the first rain with her face turned up and her eyes closed, and Theodore stood beside her getting equally wet. And after a moment she laughed, and it was the same full, unguarded laugh he had first heard in the August afternoon, and he thought, as he had thought then, that it was one of the finest sounds he had ever been close to. They went to see the San Antonio land together in December, making the journey by train from the nearest station, 20 miles east of Harlan Creek, a thing that felt like a small ceremony in itself. The land was exactly as the documents had described it, 40 acres along a clear-running creek, well-grassed after the autumn rains, with a stand of live oak trees along the water that cast good shade and held the soil in place. Inez walked every part of it methodically, the way she approached anything of importance, and Theodore walked with her, and at the end she stood at the edge of the creek and watched the water run over the stones and said nothing for a long time. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," she said, "that he wanted to give me something permanent, something that couldn't fail in a drought or be lost in a bad season, and I think he chose well." She paused. "I'm also thinking that this land could support a good-sized cattle operation if someone had the right management. Someone like a woman who has been managing a farm since she was 17. She looked at him sideways. "Someone like that, yes. With perhaps a partner who handles the legal side of any necessary land transactions. I know a man who does exactly that kind of work," Theodore said. She smiled at the creek. "I thought you might." Cornelius Briggs came out of his office at the end of Commerce Street to meet them in person, and he shook Inez's hand with the formality of a man who took people seriously from the first moment, and asked her 3 direct questions about the land and her plans for it, and listened to her answers with complete attention, and at the end said to Theodore, "You were right. She is very sensible." And to Inez, "The legal work on the formal transfer will take 3 weeks. Everything is in order." "Congratulations on your inheritance, Miss Kendrick." "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was the person she was, she added, "Could you also tell me whether there are any other heirs to the Rourke estate who might have a legitimate claim to contest the bequest? I want to understand the full picture." Briggs looked at her with an expression that was as close to delight as his face normally allowed. "There are not," he said. "Mr. Rourke had no other family and the will was unambiguous. The land is yours, all of it." Theodore watched Inez absorb this, the finality of it, and saw something settle in her, as though the last piece of a long-carried weight had been set down, properly and for good. He proposed to her in January, in the kitchen of her farmhouse on a Sunday morning while the coffee was on the stove, and the winter light was coming through the window in pale gold, and the farm outside was quiet and frost-dusted and entirely hers. He did not make a great production of it. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where he had first laid the legal documents 6 months before, and he said, "I would like to ask you something, if you're willing to hear it." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "Go ahead." "I want to spend my life being the person closest to you," he said. "Not because I think you need someone, because you have made it extremely clear that you are more than capable of managing on your own, but because I want the particular life that being beside you makes possible, which is a life where I am more honest and more useful and more fully myself than I have managed to be without you." He paused. "I would like to marry you, Inez, if you want the same." She set down her coffee cup very carefully. She was quiet for a long moment, but not a hesitating quiet, not the quiet of uncertainty. It was the quiet of someone letting something settle completely before speaking, the way she always did when something mattered enough to get exactly right. "I do want that," she said. "Very much." He exhaled, and she saw it, the slight release in his shoulders, and she said, "Were you actually worried I would say no?" "You are a woman of formidable independence," he said. "I respected the possibility." She laughed and reached across the table and took his hand properly, not briefly the way she had in August, but fully, lacing her fingers through his, and looked at him with all the warmth and clarity and completeness of a person who knew exactly where she stood. "Yes," she said again for the certainty of it. "Absolutely yes." They married in April, in the small church that doubled as a schoolhouse, in a ceremony conducted by the Reverend Marsh that was well attended by most of Harlan Creek and the surrounding farms, and that had, as its undisputed highlight, the moment when Maria Garza, serving as Inez's attendant, wept openly and unashamedly throughout the vows, and then immediately denied having done so at the reception afterward. Eduardo and Rosario Garza had contributed the wedding supper, a fact that they stated as a declaration rather than an offer, and it was extraordinary. Cornelius Briggs had ridden up from San Antonio and sat in the front row looking precisely as pleased as his reserved manner allowed, and perhaps slightly more. Theodore's mother, Frances Hale, had come up from Austin and had, within approximately 4 minutes of meeting Inez Kendrick, formed the opinion that this was exactly the right woman for her son, which she communicated to him privately with the characteristically direct efficiency of a woman who had raised cattle and a son on her own for 20 years and had no patience for beating around the bush. "She's wonderful," Frances told Theodore. "Don't do anything foolish." "I'm working very hard not to," he said. They spent their first married year building things. The legal practice, which was growing steadily, the decisions about the San Antonio land, which they leased to a neighboring rancher for the first year while they figured out their longer-term plans, the small improvements to the Harlan Creek farm that came with 2 wages and 1 shared set of priorities. And they built, over those months, the particular intimacy of 2 people who had come to each other as full adults with full histories and chose each other anyway and chose each other every day after. Over the morning coffee, over the evening porch sitting, over the arguments about things that mattered and the laughter about things that didn't, over the careful, honest work of being known by another person and knowing them in return. Inez decided by the following spring to travel to San Antonio to visit Elias Rourke's grave. She had been thinking about it for months. She told Theodore and she wanted to go. He went with her, of course. The grave was in a cemetery on the south side of the city, modestly marked in the same way his daughter's farm was modestly maintained, with simplicity and a kind of determined dignity. Inez stood before the stone and was quiet for a long time. Theodore stood beside her and held her hand. "I came," she said finally to the stone. "I thought you should know that I came to see the land you left me, and it's a good piece of land. I'm going to take proper care of it." She paused. "I still have questions. I expect I always will. But I also understand something now that I didn't when I first read your letter, which is that people carry things in silence for a very long time when they don't see another way, and that doesn't make them entirely lost. Just human." She was quiet another moment. "I forgive you. I think my mother would have, too, given enough time. I hope that means something, wherever you are." Theodore did not say anything. He held her hand, and the morning was cool and clear, and the old live oaks around the cemetery moved in the spring wind, and after a while they walked back through the city together and had breakfast at a small cafe near the river and talked about the land, and their plans, and the future. Their son was born in late October of 1880, in the farmhouse in Harlan Creek, brought into the world with the assistance of Rosario Garza, who had served as midwife in this county for 15 years and was calm and competent and thoroughly in command throughout. Theodore, who had been told he could stay or wait outside and had chosen to stay, sat beside Inez and held her hand through the long hours of it, and when the baby arrived and the room was full of sound and light, he looked at his wife and she looked at him, and everything that existed between them, the legal documents and the long letters and the evening conversations and the year of careful honest choosing, was in that look. They named him Elias Thomas Hale. Elias for the man who had given his mother something permanent to stand on. Thomas for the man who had raised her and loved her and given her a name. Inez held the baby in the winter light of the bedroom and Theodore sat beside them, and she looked down at the round, earnest face of their son with an expression that was completely new and completely right. "Hello," she said to him, soft and certain. "We've been waiting for you." The years that followed were full years, the years of a life built deliberately and tended with care. Theo's legal practice grew steady and respected, and he became known in the county as a man who dealt straight with people regardless of their circumstances, who had helped 3 families keep their land when administrative errors had threatened to take it from them, and who had argued successfully in the county court that Eduardo Garza's original land title, which a neighboring property holder had attempted to contest through the manipulation of old survey records, was valid and complete. Eduardo Garza had shaken Theodore's hand outside the courthouse on the day that verdict came down, and the feeling of it, the weight of that handshake, was something Theodore carried for the rest of his life. The San Antonio land they eventually worked themselves, after Elias was 3 and sturdy, and old enough to be left with Rosario Garza without anxiety, and they went down together to start the small cattle operation that Inez had envisioned at the edge of the creek. It was hard work and good work, and it grew. They hired 2 hands, good men, one of whom had family in the area and proved to be the most knowledgeable person either of them had ever met on the subject of creek management. Maria Garza married a rancher named Samuel Cole from 2 counties over in 1881, and the wedding was the mirror of Inez's in many respects. The same church, the same food from Rosario's kitchen, and Inez crying openly during the vows with complete lack of self-consciousness, which Maria would later describe with great affection as the finest wedding gift she received. They had a second child 3 years after Elias, a daughter they named Clara Frances, Clara for Inez's mother and Frances for Theodore's, a decision they arrived at independently and then discovered simultaneously, which produced the specific kind of delighted laughter that a marriage generates when it has been built on the right foundations. Elias grew up between Harlan Creek and the San Antonio land, a boy of serious eyes and deliberate movements who looked, as he grew older, somewhat like his mother, and somewhat like a photograph Theodore had once seen of a tall, broad-chested man who had built a ranch in San Antonio and spent 30 years carrying a silence he should have broken sooner. Clara Frances grew up bright and vivid and unstoppable, with her father's steady eyes and her mother's iron will and Maria Garza's complete disregard for any expectation that she be anything other than exactly what she was. On an evening in the autumn of 1885, when Elias was 5 and Clara was 2 and the farm was good, and the cattle operation was beginning to show the kind of returns that made the future feel solid, Inez and Theodore sat on the porch of the Harlan Creek farmhouse in the cool of the evening, the way they had sat from almost the very beginning. The cottonwood above them was older now and broader, and its shadow in the late afternoon stretched halfway across the yard. The children were inside with their supper. The land around them was quiet and complete in the particular way of autumn in Texas, the grass gone amber, the sky enormous and still. "I was thinking today," Inez said, "about the day you rode up the track. You were covered in road dust and your horse looked about as tired as you did." "I was half-cooked," he said. "Your words." "I could tell," she agreed. "And I thought, this man has ridden a long way." She was quiet for a moment. I didn't know yet what he was bringing with him. I just thought 3 days in the heat. He must consider it worth the journey. I did, he said. I know, she said. I know that now. The evening settled around them, and the cottonwood moved in the light wind. And from inside the house came the sounds of children and the small domestic music of a life being lived fully. And Inez leaned her head briefly against Theodore's shoulder, a gesture she had adopted somewhere in the first year of their marriage that was entirely instinctive and entirely her. And he turned his head and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. And they sat together in the amber autumn evening on the porch of the farm she had kept alive by the pure force of her will, looking out at the land that was theirs now, rooted and real and full of years ahead of them. Everything that had been begun in the summer of 1878, with a sealed envelope and a hard ride through the Texas heat, had become this: a marriage of equals, a family built with intention, a life in which grief had been received honestly and processed into something that strengthened rather than diminished, and two people who had found each other in the precise moment when they most needed finding, and had, with every day that followed, chosen not to let that go. The stars came out one by one above the prairie, the way they always did in flat Texas country, starting as single bright points and building into the overwhelming, generous dark, and Inez and Theodore sat beneath them until the evening was entirely night. And the children called from inside, and they went in together, the door closing behind them warm and whole and complete.